May 15th, 2026. Cannes. A 72-year-old man walks the red carpet in a cream beret and a black three-piece suit. His daughter, Ella, 26, is beside him. The festival director steps forward and, without warning, places an honorary Palme d'Or in his hands. John Travolta puts a hand to his chest, and almost himself, he says, "This is beyond the Oscar. It is a beautiful moment." But to understand why it broke so many people watching, look at who is not in the picture. Where's the woman who stood beside him the last time he walked into Cannes in 1994 for Pulp Fiction? Where's the 16-year-old son who used to climb into his lap on long flights? Where's the marriage that survived everything Hollywood threw at it? Kelly Preston has been gone since the summer of 2020. Jett, 16, in a Bahamas bathroom on a January morning in 2009 has been gone even longer. What this old movie star was holding back on that French red carpet was not the surprise of an award. It was 32 years of life between two appearances, a wife who was gone, a son who was gone, and a family that could never look the same again. This story is not really about a comeback at Cannes. It is about a boy who grew up on the LaGuardia's flight path and who spent his life chasing control through dance, through flight, through fame, through family, only to learn that love was the one thing he could never protect. Tonight, we trace it from the beginning. To understand John Travolta, you have to go back to a small town in New Jersey on a February morning in 1954, when a working-class Catholic family of 7 was about to become a family of 8. He was the sixth child, the last one. By the time he could walk, the household upstairs already had its rhythm. 5 older brothers and sisters, a father who worked long days in the tire business, a mother who taught high school drama at night, and the constant low hum of an aircraft passing somewhere overhead. The town was called Englewood, just across the Hudson from New York City. The Travoltas were not poor in the legend-making sense. There were no sleeping in cars, no missed meals, no childhood stories sold later as proof of suffering. But they were not rich either. The father, Sam Travolta, sold tires for a living and had once played semi-pro football and semi-pro baseball before settling into family life. He was a physical man. Big shoulders, big laugh. The kind of father who, in the language of that generation, fixed things. The mother, Helen, was a different kind of presence. She had been an actress before her children arrived and now taught high school drama in addition to raising 6 kids. She did not just love the theater. She lived inside it. And she did something for her children that would shape at least one of their lives forever. She convinced their father to build a miniature theater in the basement. CBS News, in one of its earliest profiles of John Travolta, recorded it in a single sentence. He grew up in a small theater his father built in the basement. That sentence carries the entire architecture of his childhood. Some boys grow up around tools. Some grow up around horses. Some grow up around oceans. John Travolta grew up around stage. A real one, just small. Painted wood. A curtain that could open and close. His mother directed her children there. They learned how to enter a scene. Above that basement, in the bright red recreation room that Time magazine would later describe, the bulletin board on the wall covered in 6 children's photographs. The family ate, fought, laughed, and rehearsed. But the second great inheritance of John Travolta's childhood was happening outside the house. Englewood sits beneath the flight path of LaGuardia Airport. In the 1950s, before commercial aviation became background noise, the planes overhead were lower, louder, and harder to ignore. They flew right over the town. They flew right over the Travolta house. Years later, in a 2013 interview, he described what that did to a small boy. He used to lie on his back in the yard and watch them the way other children watched birds. He did not just see them. He waited for them. He waited for the next one, and the next one, and the next one. When he was 8 years old, his older sister took him on his first airplane trip. He never really came down. Inside the house, there was dance and music and the small basement stage. Outside the house, there was the sky. From the time he was old enough to talk, John Travolta was already living between two impulses that would never leave him: the impulse to perform and the impulse to fly. At 6 years old, he was watching his older sister Ellen perform in a touring road company production of Gypsy. He learned the songs from records. He sang them out loud to himself in his sister's room. By 9, he was on a workshop stage of his own in a play called Who'll Save the Plowboy. By 12, he was already taking tap lessons from a man named Fred Kelly, the older brother of Gene Kelly. At Dwight Morrow High School, he was not, by his own admission, a strong student. But something in the hallways pulled him in. There was always a radio playing somewhere. There was always music coming from somebody's locker or from the parking lot or from the gym. There was always somebody dancing. In a 1978 interview with Time magazine, he said it in one sentence: "Whatever new dance came to school, I learned it. That is not a normal teenage hobby. That is a vocation." While other boys his age were finding cars and girls in trouble, John Travolta was studying movement the way a young pianist studies scales, quietly, patiently, every single day. He was 16 years old when he made the decision that would change everything. He told his parents he was leaving high school. He was going to New York. He was going to live with his older sister, Anne. He was going to act. His parents, and this is a part of the story that the legend often forgets, said yes. Not because they were reckless, because they had been preparing him to leave the basement stage his whole life. His mother had taught him scenes. His father had built the platform. His sister had taken him on his first flight. And now their youngest child was telling them he was going to do it for real. He left. He boarded a bus. And the boy who used to lie on his back in Englewood, watching planes pass overhead, the boy who had learned every dance that ever entered his high school hallway, was finally going to find out what he could do with both halves of himself. He had no idea what it would cost him. He arrived in New York with a small suitcase and his sister Anne's address. The year was 1970. He was 16. Manhattan in those years was loud, broke, and dangerous in places, but it was also the most ambitious city in America. Off-Broadway was full of new playwrights. Television was hungry for new faces. The dance studio stayed open late. And the boy from Englewood, the one who had learned every dance that came through his high school hallway, was about to find out that the years in the basement had prepared him better than he knew. His earliest work came fast, in a way that work sometimes comes fast for people whose preparation is hidden. In 1972, he was cast in an off-Broadway production of Rain. Soon after, he was hired into the touring company of Grease, the same musical that, 6 years later, would change his life on screen. In those years, he was making rent, picking up agents, and beginning to understand the difference between being noticed and being chosen. One of the people who chose him was a young manager named Bob Lamond. Lamond saw something in him that other people had missed and would spend the rest of the decade making sure the world saw it too. In 1975, the wave broke. That single year, John Travolta did 3 things almost at once. He made his Broadway debut in a wartime musical called Over Here, alongside the surviving Andrews sisters. He filmed his first motion picture, a low-budget horror film called The Devil's Rain. And he landed a role on a new ABC sitcom about a tough Brooklyn high school called Welcome Back, Kotter. The role was Vinnie Barbarino. The character was, on paper, a comic teen with a thick Brooklyn accent and a stubborn streak. But the way John Travolta played him, the way he stood, the way he stalled before a line, the way he could go from confident to vulnerable inside a single take, turned Vinnie Barbarino into something the network had not planned for. He turned him into a heartthrob. The fan mail came in by the bag. Teenage girls covered their bedroom walls with his face. By 1976, he was no longer just a TV actor. He was a pop star. That year, he released the single Let Her In, and it climbed the Billboard chart. He recorded multiple pop albums. By the end of the decade, the trade press would even name him one of Billboard's top male vocalists of the year. He was 22 years old, but the role that quietly mattered most was not on the sitcom. In 1976, he was cast in a television movie called The Boy in the Plastic Bubble. He played a young man born with a fatal immune deficiency, condemned to live inside a transparent room. It was a small project made for TV, the kind of part most rising stars would have skipped. He did not skip it. And on that set, he met a woman who would change the shape of his life. Her name was Diana Hyland. She was 39 years old. She had a young son from a previous marriage. She was, by every account, calm, steady, intelligent, and warm in a way the entertainment business rarely is. She was 18 years older than he was. None of that mattered. By the time production wrapped, they were in love. He had never been in love before, not in a serious way. He had been a teen idol for 1 year and a working actor for 4, and he had spent most of that time learning how to be looked at. Now, for the first time, he was learning how to be seen. While he was falling in love, his career was about to go vertical. In late 1976, John Travolta was offered a lead in a low-budget film about a young man in Brooklyn who escapes the dead end of his neighborhood by going to the disco on Saturday nights. The script was nothing special on the page. The budget was modest. The director was a man named John Badham. The character's name was Tony Manero. The film was called Saturday Night Fever. He filmed it in Brooklyn through the early months of 1977. He danced every step himself. He shed weight for the role. He worked with a choreographer until his body could deliver, in a single take, the kind of movement most film stars fake with editing. And when the film was released in December that year, something happened that nobody around him could have prepared him for. He became a phenomenon. Saturday Night Fever went on to gross approximately $237 million worldwide, an astonishing number for a small Brooklyn drama made on a budget most studios would barely notice today. The soundtrack, anchored by the Bee Gees, became one of the best-selling albums in music history. And the white polyester suit Tony Manero wore on the disco floor, open collar, narrow lapels, dark shirt underneath, was, in the words of Britannica, a symbol of the era. It would hang, decades later, in museums. He had made it. By every measure the world used to measure such things, money, fame, beauty, recognition, John Travolta had crossed over to the other side. He was a movie star. He was on the cover of every magazine in America. The boy from Englewood, who had once watched planes pass over his backyard, was now the most photographed young man in the country. But on the set of Saturday Night Fever, in the early months of 1977, while Brooklyn was building him a kingdom, the woman he had fallen in love was beginning a fight she would not win. And the film that would crown him a king was being built, day by day, on top of goodbye he had not yet finished saying. The diagnosis came in 1976. Diana Hyland had breast cancer. By the time The Boy in the Plastic Bubble aired on television, she was already in treatment. By the time John Travolta began filming Saturday Night Fever in Brooklyn in the early months of 1977, she was already losing the fight. He flew back and forth across the country between takes. The same young man who, 6 years earlier, had arrived in New York with one suitcase, was now flying California to sit by a hospital bed. He did this for months. Brooklyn during the day. Los Angeles whenever he could. The film he was making was the most physically demanding work of his young life. Every day of choreography required hours of preparation. Every shot required him to deliver the kind of movement that defined the character. And every weekend he could spare, he was on a plane watching the woman he loved grow smaller. A few months earlier, he had been learning how to be in love for the first time. Now, he was learning how to say goodbye. In March of 1977, Diana Hyland passed away. She was 41 years old. He was 23. The public record is restrained on the details. The way the public record tends to be when grief belongs more to a family than to a press release. What is known is that he was with her in California in the final weeks. What is known is that she had a young son who would, in the years to come, be partly raised by him. What is known, above all, is what happened next. He flew back to Brooklyn. He went back to the set. Turner Classic Movies, in one of the more careful retrospectives written about that period, recorded it in a single devastating sentence. After Hyland's passing, the network said John Travolta returned to the set of Saturday Night Fever, almost like a zombie. That phrase has carried the weight of his early life for almost 5 decades. It is shorthand for a young actor doing the thing actors are supposed to do, finishing the job, holding the choreography, hitting the marks, while inside, somewhere underneath the suit, he was hollow. He finished the film. He finished the dance sequences. He stood in front of the cameras in the white suit. He did the close-ups. He gave performances that would, within 9 months, change the rest of his life. And when filming wrapped, he went home and waited for the world to see what they had built. What the world saw in December of 1977 was Tony Manero. What John Travolta knew, sitting in the dark of a theater on opening night, was something the audience did not. He knew which take had been filmed the week he had last spoken to her. He knew which dance number had been rehearsed the morning after he came back from California. He knew which close-up had been shot on the day he could barely speak between scenes. The version of himself the world was about to fall in love with had been built, day by day, on top of the version of himself that was quietly breaking. Saturday Night Fever opened to a cultural reception almost no other film of that decade would match. The Bee Gees soundtrack became one of the highest-selling albums in history. Disco, for a few brief years, became the dominant sound of American popular music. And John Travolta, with his white polyester suit, his pointed finger, and his straight stare into the camera, became one of the most recognizable young men in the world. He could not walk down a street without being followed. He could not eat at a restaurant without people asking him to dance. He was being introduced to studio heads, to musicians, to politicians, to anyone who wanted to be photographed next to the future. And inside the version of himself the cameras could see, there was another version, quieter, harder, less photogenic, still standing somewhere in a hospital room in California, not yet finished saying goodbye. In February of 1978, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences gave him the recognition that would change the rest of his career. They nominated him for Best Actor. He was the youngest nominee in his category that year. He sat in the theater the night of the ceremony with the entire industry watching. He did not win. It did not matter. The nomination alone secured him a place in American film history that, in his generation, had been held by only a handful of young actors. But here's the truth the highlight reels do not show. Within 12 months, from the spring of 1977 to the spring of 1978, John Travolta watched The First Woman he had loved leave the world, finished a film that would crown him, watched that film release into the largest cultural reception of any young performer in his generation, became one of the most recognizable faces in America, and earned his first Academy Award nomination. It was the highest year of his early life. It was the worst year of his early life. And he had just learned a lesson the rest of his story would refuse to stop teaching him. You can rehearse a scene 1,000 times. You can fly back and forth across the country. You can stand in the lights at every premiere. You can become, in the eyes of the world, more famous than almost any 23-year-old who has ever lived. And it will not be enough to keep someone alive. The years between 1978 and 1993 are often described, in the shorthand of celebrity journalism, as John Travolta's decline. That framing is not wrong, exactly, but it is incomplete, because what happened to his career in the 1980s was not a single fall. It was a slow retreat from a height that very few people in the history of Hollywood had ever reached. And the retreat happened for the same reason most retreats happen. He had sprinted too far, too fast, and the world that had coronated him wanted something from him that he could not keep giving. In 1978, he filmed Grease, the same musical he had toured with as a teenager in New Jersey. The film grossed nearly $396 million worldwide. The soundtrack became a generational anthem. In 1980, Urban Cowboy launched a country music craze that swept from Texas to every bar in the American South. For 3 consecutive years, he was among the most commercially reliable actors in the world. Then the scripts got worse. Then the hits stopped coming. Two of a Kind in 1983. Perfect in 1985. Projects that should not have had his name on them, and films that confirmed what the industry had quietly begun to suspect, that the white suit and the pointed finger were of a very specific time, and the time was passing. By the late 1980s, he was no longer being offered the roles that had made him. He was being offered the memory of those roles. There is a difference, and he was smart enough to feel it. He spent more time in the cockpit. Flying by then was not a hobby. He had been accumulating flight hours since the mid-1970s, and by the late 1980s, he held ratings for multiple large aircraft, including Boeing commercial jets. He had over 9,000 hours of log flight time. He had acquired Boeing 707, and later arranged his entire residential life around the ability to keep it nearby. He spoke about the sky the way other people speak about home, as if being up there was the only place where the equation was simple. You climb, you level, you navigate, you land. The variables are hard, but they are honest. The cockpit does not ask you what happened to your last 5 films. In November of 1992, the cockpit nearly killed him. The date was the 24th. He was 38 years old. He was flying a Gulfstream II tail number N728T out of Fort Lauderdale late in the evening, headed to Maine. On board were Kelly Preston, their 7-month-old son, and several family members and friends. The flight was routine until it was not. Somewhere over the East Coast, the aircraft suffered a complete electrical failure. Every instrument on the panel went dark. The autopilot disconnected. The communications equipment went silent. The cockpit, designed to display altitude, speed, attitude, heading, was, in the language of the NTSB report and subsequent Washington Post coverage, a black box at 12,000 feet. The only navigational tool that retained any function was a single tiny magnetic compass, mounted above the instrument panel. The only way to read it was to point a small flashlight at it. He and the co-pilot flew by that compass in the dark for minutes that must have felt like hours. The worst danger in that situation is not the blackness. It is what pilots call spatial disorientation, the point at which your body begins to lie to you about which way is up. When you lose the horizon, when you lose the instruments, when you lose every reference point except the sensation in your own muscles, your brain constructs a horizon that is not there. Pilots call it the leans. It has killed people who were flying perfectly good aircraft. They descended through a thick overcast. At approximately 1,000 feet, they emerged from clouds. The first thing they saw was the red beacon light on the top of the Washington Monument. They diverted to Washington National Airport. There were no working brakes, no flaps. They approached the runway at approximately 145 knots, significantly faster than a normal landing. When the wheels hit the runway, he deployed the emergency braking system. The aircraft stopped, All 4 main landing gear tires had blown. Nobody on board was injured. Years later, he would describe the moment in an interview and use a sentence that left no room for paraphrase. "I thought it was over." The full thought, he said, had formed clearly in his mind in the dark cockpit. "I cannot believe I am going to die on this plane." He did not die on that plane. But the night over the East Coast told him something about control, the thing he'd been building his entire life. Through choreography and discipline and logged flight hours and sheer force of professional will, that no film set had ever told him. It told him that there was a version of uncontrollable that lived in the sky above Washington, D.C., and that it did not care about his 9,000 hours. By the time that flight landed, John Travolta had already built the other part of his life that was supposed to hold. He had met Kelly Preston in 1989 on the set of a film called The Experts. She was an actress from Hawaii, warm and grounded and steady in all the ways that life in front of the camera tends to corrode. They married in 1991 in Paris. 2 years later, their son Jett was born. The house in Ocala, Florida, the one that Architectural Digest would eventually describe as nearly 9,000 square feet of concrete and glass, with 25-foot windows facing a 135-foot Boeing 707, was being planned. He was building a life that was, in the language of that life, complete. A wife who understood him. A child. A runway outside the front door. A home designed around the thing he loved most, other than the people inside it. And then, in 1994, the career came back. Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction premiered at the Cannes Film Festival that year and won the Palme d'Or. John Travolta played Vincent Vega, unhurried, wry, dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with Saturday Night Fever, and everything to do with what a decade of being underestimated does to a man who knows what he is capable of. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences gave him his second Best Actor nomination. The film grossed over $213 million worldwide. The following year, Get Shorty earned him a Golden Globe for Best Actor in a musical or comedy. He was nominated, across his career, 9 times by the Hollywood Foreign Press. He won 3 times. He was back, not as a comeback story. He was too smart for that framing, but as something more durable. He was now the actor who had survived the decade that was supposed to bury him. That is a different kind of authority. It is the kind of authority that does not need the suit. Kelly was in Cannes with him for Pulp Fiction. She was in the audience when he walked onto the stage. She was there for the part of the life that was supposed to get better from that point forward. For a while, it did. But Jett, their firstborn son, who by then was 5 years old, and whose doctors had begun tracking a pattern of seizures that came every 5 to 10 days, lasting 45 seconds to a minute, followed by 12 hours of sleep. Jett was already the thing John Travolta could not fix by flying faster or dancing better or landing on a runway in the dark. And the years ahead would prove it. The Travoltas had gone to the Bahamas for the holidays. It was the kind of trip a family takes at the end of a good year. A rented house on Grand Bahama Island, warm weather, a break from the calendar. John was 54 years old. Kelly was 46. Jett was 16. Ella, their daughter, was 8. Benjamin, the youngest, was not yet born. By most outward measures, the life they had built was what it appeared to be. The house in Ocala was real. The marriage was real. The family was real. The runway outside the front door was real. And Jett, who had been their firstborn, their oldest child, the boy who had seizures every 5 to 10 days and slept for 12 hours afterward, Jett was real too. His condition was managed. His parents traveled with him. He went on vacation with the family, the way any 16-year-old goes on vacation with his family. On the morning of January 2nd, 2009, a babysitter woke John Travolta and Kelly Preston. He told them to come downstairs. In the court testimony he gave 9 months later, in Nassau, John Travolta described what happened next in the kind of language that tells you a person has rehearsed their own memories so many times it has become a sequence of actions rather than a story. He and Kelly were woken at approximately 10:15 in the morning. He ran downstairs. When he arrived, another caregiver was already performing chest compressions on his son. He took over. He performed mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. An ambulance was called. Jett was transported to a hospital in Freeport. He did not survive. He was 16 years old. In the days that followed, the family released a statement. The press covered the way the press covers the deaths of celebrity children, intensely, briefly, and with very little interest in what a father looks like when he comes back up from the floor of a house where his son just died. Tributes came in. Public condolences were issued. The family asked for privacy. What John Travolta did next, what anyone does next after that, is not something that fits cleanly into a narrative about fame and career and the arc of Hollywood life. He buried his son. He went home. Ian and Kelly held what remained of their family together in the months that followed. The way you hold something together after a structural piece has been removed, carefully, slowly, with a constant awareness that the shape of the thing has changed and will not change back. But the world was not finished with him yet. In September 2009, he was called to testify before a court in Nassau, Bahamas. The case had nothing to do with justice for Jett. It had everything to do with what happened in the hours and days after his son's death, when two men, a paramedic named Torino Lightbourne and a former Bahamian senator named Pleasant Bridgewater, allegedly attempted to extort the Travolta family for $25 million. The claim, according to prosecutors, was that the men had threatened to release sensitive material related to the circumstances of Jett's death unless they were paid. Travolta sat in the witness box. He answered questions. He described, on public record, the medical history of his son. He stated, for the first time in a public proceeding, that Jett was autistic. He described the seizure disorder, the frequency, the duration, the 12 hours of sleep that followed each episode. He described the morning of January 2nd. He described the compressions. He described the moment he took over from the caregiver. He described in a Bahamian courtroom for a jury and a press corps the morning his son died. There is no way to write that sentence that makes it smaller than it is. He had spent his entire professional life learning to give the world a version of himself it could watch. He had learned to control what the camera saw, what the audience received, what image attached to his name in the cultural record. He had sat for thousands of interviews. He had posed for thousands of photographs. He had walked thousands of red carpets. None of that preparation, none of the 9,000 flight hours, none of the choreography, none of the lines memorized, none of the roles inhabited, had prepared him for the specific indignity of being required to testify, publicly, about the worst morning of his life, in a proceeding that existed not because of anything he had done, but because someone had decided that his grief had a price. In October 2009, the case ended in a mistrial, not because the evidence collapsed. The mistrial was declared because a local political figure had publicly revealed what appeared to be jury deliberation results before a verdict was reached. The court determined that this had compromised the integrity of the proceedings. The jury was dismissed. The case was suspended. A year later, in September 2010, the Bahamian authorities officially dropped the charges. The case was over. Lightbourne and Bridgewater would not be tried again. John Travolta issued a brief public statement. He said the case had caused his family a heavy emotional toll. He said that because of that toll, he would not voluntarily return to Bahamas to testify in any future proceeding. He had done what the court required of him. He had said, on the public record, what needed to be said. He was done. What lingered, what does not appear in the timeline of case filings and dismissal notices, is something harder to document but easier to understand. He was 56 years old in 2010. He had been famous for 33 years. In those 33 years, he had buried his first love, nearly died in a black cockpit over the eastern seaboard, survived a decade in which Hollywood had written him off, come back on the strength of one film to earn a second Academy Award nomination, and build a family in a house with a runway outside the front door. And now, the oldest of his 3 children was buried in a cemetery in Maine. There's a line from the testimony, not the emotional center of it, but a factual sentence he gave the court almost in passing, that carries, in retrospect, more weight than any other detail from that year. He was describing the seizures. He was explaining the pattern, the frequency, the duration, the aftermath. He said, every 5 to 10 days, 45 seconds to a minute. Then he would sleep for 12 hours. A father who knows his son's seizure schedule with that kind of precision is a father who's been measuring time by a different clock than the rest of the world. Every 5 to 10 days, he had been watching. Every 45 seconds, he had been counting. Every 12 hours of sleep, he had been waiting for Jett to wake up on the other side. That is not a description of a seizure disorder. That is a description of a man who had been spending years trying to protect something by watching it closely enough, measuring it carefully enough, being present enough. The same way he had once learned every dance that came through his high school hallway. The same way he had logged 9,000 hours in a cockpit. The same way he had rebuilt a career that the industry had abandoned. Control applied to the thing he loved most. And for 16 years, it had worked. Until the morning it didn't. And that is why the image from Canon 2026 cannot be understood as a simple award moment. By itself, it looked beautiful. A legendary actor. A daughter beside him. A festival honoring him after half a century on screen. But after Bahamas, after Nassau, after the years of measuring Jett's seizures by days and minutes and hours of sleep, that can photograph meant something else. It was not only a picture of who had survived. It was a picture of who had not. On the evening of May 15th, 2026, Thierry Frémaux, the director of the film festival, stepped onto a stage and placed an honorary Palme d'Or into John Travolta's hands. Travolta had not known it was coming. He pressed his hand to his chest. His face changed. And then, in the way that a person sometimes speaks when they're not performing, but simply present, when the version of themselves the world has been watching for 50 years momentarily steps aside, he said what he actually thought. This is beyond the Oscar. He was not diminishing the Academy. He was saying something true. The Oscar nomination had come when he was young, beautiful, and still becoming a legend. This Palme d'Or came to a 72-year-old man who had flown himself to France with his daughter, carrying a film he had written about the first morning his life lifted off the ground. Those are not equivalent events. He was right. Ella was beside him. The last time John Travolta walked into like this, in 1994, for Pulp Fiction, the film that brought him back from a decade the industry had written off as a eulogy, Kelly Preston had been standing where Ella stood now. She had been 31 years old. He had been 40. They had been married for 3 years. Jett was 1. 32 years is a long time. Long enough for a generation of filmgoers to grow up not knowing who Vinnie Barbarino was. Long enough for a son to be born and loved and lost. Long enough for a marriage of 29 years to become a Ray Charles cover sung to an empty room on a birthday in October. Long enough for a boy who grew up watching planes from his backyard to build a house around a runway. And then, finally, at 72, to make a film about the first morning he understood why. He held the award. Ella held his arm. The cameras took the photograph that the world would see the next morning. And somewhere inside that image, in the space around the 2 people the camera could see, was a quiet calculation every grieving family knows. The names that are present in every room, even when they are not. He did not say any of that on the stage. He said the thing about the Oscar. He thanked the festival. He put his hand to his chest one more time. Then the lights came up. The audience applauded. And the boy from Englewood, the one who had once watched planes cross the sky above his backyard and had spent the next 64 years learning what it costs to love something you could not keep, walked off the stage with his daughter into the night. But the missing person in that image was not only Jett. There was another absent standing beside Ella that night, quieter, older, and in some ways even more visible. Kelly Preston had been there the last time can change John Travolta's life. In 1994, when Pulp Fiction brought him back from a decade of decline, she was beside him. By 2026, she was gone. Kelly Preston died on July 12, 2020, after a private 2-year battle with breast cancer. She was 57 years old. The statement the family released was brief. It said that she had fought bravely, with the love and support of so many. It said she was gone. It did not say the rest, which is that John Travolta was now 66 years old, and that the woman who had stood beside him in 1994, who had been in the cockpit of his life for 29 years, who had been the other parent in the house with the runway outside the front door, that woman was gone, too. He had buried a first love. He had buried a son. Now, he had buried a wife. There are people whose lives teach them the same lesson once, and people whose lives keep returning to the same lesson until the lesson is all there is. John Travolta is the second kind of person. The lesson that love was the one thing he could not protect by trying harder, flying better, or showing it more carefully was now 3 times confirmed. And the confirmation had arrived in a different form each time. Diana Hyland, cancer at 41. Jett, a seizure at 16. Kelly, cancer again at 57. He was left with Ella, who was 20 years old, and Benjamin, who was 10. A 10-year-old understands death differently than a 66-year-old does. A 10-year-old does not have the vocabulary for pattern. He only has the fact of it, that his mother was there and now she was not. And in the months after Kelly's death, Benjamin said something to his father that John Travolta would later describe in an interview with ABC News in August of 2021. He said, "I'm afraid you're going to die too, because Mommy died." That sentence, from a 10-year-old boy to a 66-year-old father, contains the entire weight of what that house had been holding since 2009. Benjamin had been born in 2010, after Jett was gone, after Bahamas, after the courtroom in Nassau. He had grown up in a family that already had an absence in it. And now the second person was gone, and the boy was doing the arithmetic that children do when the world stops making the promises it was supposed to keep. Travolta told him the truth. He told Benjamin that Jett had died when he was 16. He told him that Kelly had died when she was 57. He looked at his son and said the sentence he had apparently been preparing, or perhaps simply living toward for years. Nobody knows when they're going to go or when they're going to stay. That is not a comforting sentence. It does not close the wound. It does not replace the mother in the room or bring the brother back. It is instead the sentence of a man who has stopped trying to manage the unmanageable, who has reached, after 66 years and 3 devastating losses, the far end of what control can do, and has decided to hand his son the truth instead. There's a version of that conversation that gets written about as a celebrity's grief, processed in the language of tabloid sympathy. There's another version that is simply a father in a house he built around a runway, telling a small boy that the sky does not always bring people back. He had learned that the hard way. Twice. Now he was teaching it. In January of 2025, John Travolta posted a New Year's photograph on social media. The image showed 3 people, himself, Ella, now 25, and Benjamin, 14. They were smiling. The caption said, simply, "Happy New Year from the Travolta family." It is a beautiful photograph. It is also, for anyone paying attention, a picture subtraction. The family that had lived in the Ocala house, The family that Architectural Digest had profiled in 2006. The family that used to watch him land a Boeing in the dark from their golf cart at night. The family that had been 5 people, and then 4, and then 3. That family had become this. 2 adult children and their father. A home with a runway outside the front door, and fewer people inside than there used to be. 3 months later, in April of 2025, he posted again, this time for Jett's birthday. Happy birthday, Jett. I miss you so much. Love you forever. The boy would have been 33 years old. If you hold that number next to the other numbers in this story, 16 years old in a Bahamas bathroom, 57 years old after 2 years of treatment, 10 years old asking his father if he was going to die too, what you get is not a highlight reel. What you get is a man who has been keeping a second calendar his entire adult life. A calendar marked not by premiere dates and award ceremonies, but by the ages his people would have been if they had stayed. In October 2025, on what would have been Kelly's birthday, he posted a video of himself singing a Ray Charles song. He had recorded it for her. The caption said, "We love you." Not loved. Love. He is still using the present tense. By then, grief had become more than one event in his life. It had become a second calendar, one that kept marking birthdays, anniversaries, and empty places at the table. And still, somehow, he had decided to love anyway. But the story does not end with grief sitting inside the house. It returns to the runway outside it, to the place where John Travolta tried, again and again, to turn motion into meaning. There's a community in Ocala, Florida called Jumbo Lair. It is not a neighborhood in the conventional sense. It is a fly-in community, a residential development built around a private airstrip, where the houses face the runway the way ordinary houses face a street. The residents are pilots. The driveways are taxiways. The garages are hangars. And the airstrip itself, 7,500 feet of paved runway, long enough to accommodate aircraft that most private pilots will never fly, runs through the middle of the property like a spine. John Travolta has lived there for decades. His house, which he began planning in the late 1990s and spent 8 years completing, was described by Architectural Digest in 2006 as approximately 8,900 square feet of concrete and glass. The windows at the front of the house are 25 feet tall. They face the runway. And parked on the runway, visible from those windows, is a 135-foot Boeing 707, painted in the livery of Qantas aircraft he had once flown commercially, acquired, and kept as a permanent resident of his front yard. He did not simply want a house near an airport. He wanted a house that was the airport. He had the taxiway reinforced to bear the weight of the 707. He had the runway extended to the length required for the aircraft he intended to keep there. He had designed, from the ground up, a life in which the thing that had saved him, the cockpit, the sky, the honest algebra of altitude and heading and approach, was not something he drove to on weekends, but something he walked out his front door toward every single morning. Kelly, in the Architectural Digest profile, described it in a single detail that tells you everything about what that life looked like from the inside. She said that sometimes he would fly himself to a film set and back, the equivalent of his daily commute, and that she and the children would take a golf car out at night to watch him land. The lights of the 707 coming in over the Florida dark. The kids in the cart. The runway lit up below. That is not a celebrity anecdote. That is a family. By 2026, the family in the golf cart had changed. The children who had watched him land were now 26 and 15. The woman who had described the scene to Architectural Digest was gone. But the runway was still there. The house was still there. The 707 was still there. And John Travolta, at 72 years old, was still flying. That year, he brought something new to the runway. He had written a film. Not a project he had been hired on to, not a studio assignment, not a franchise sequel or streaming vehicle offered by someone who remembered Pulp Fiction. He had written, produced, financed, directed, and narrated it himself. Every decision his, every dollar his, every word of the script his own. He was not playing a character in someone else's story. He was, for the first time in his 50-year career, the author. The film was called Propeller One-Way Night Coach. It is a story about a young boy's first airplane flight. That sentence does not require elaboration. The boy who grew up under the flight path of LaGuardia Airport, who was 8 years old when his sister put him on a plane for the first time and changed the direction of his life, who had spent 64 years since that morning converting the sky into the most reliable thing in his world. That man had sat down at 71 years old and decided that the story worth telling, the one worth spending his own money to make, was the story of how it began. He did not take a commercial flight to Cannes for the premiere. He flew there himself. In late May of 2026, he filmed himself in the cockpit, headphones on, flight charts open, the same unhurried captain's voice he had used on long flights for 50 years, and announced over the aircraft's public address system that the flight time to Nice would be 8 hours and 45 minutes, and that the champagne was on him. He landed the plane in Nice. He drove to Cannes. He walked the red carpet in a cream beret and round glasses and a black three-piece suit with Ella beside him. And when a journalist asked about the beret, about why, after decades of appearing at premieres in the standard costume of a film star, he had chosen this particular look for this particular moment, he gave an answer that was both very simple and, in the context of his life, very precise. He said he was a director now, and old directors wore berets. I decided to play the part of a director. That sentence sounds like a joke. It is not. It is a man who has spent his entire life understanding that the roles we inhabit shape the life we are capable of living, who learned in the basement in Englewood, confirmed it in a Brooklyn disco, proved it in a screening room in 1994, deciding that at 72, after everything, he was going to step into one more part. Not the teen idol, not the comeback story, not the widower, not the grieving father, not the man who had pressed his hand to his chest in a Nassau courtroom and described the morning his son died. The director, the one who decided, this time, what the story would be about. And the story he chose to tell was the one about the first flight. After everything that happened on the ground, he returned to the one story that still made sense to him. The first time the ground fell away and the sky opened. Not because the sky had spared him. It had not. But because it was the place where the boy from Englewood had first imagined a life larger than loss. At Cannes, the world saw a man receive an award. But by now, we know that was never the whole picture. We know why Ella standing beside him mattered. We know why Kelly's absence mattered. We know why Jett's absence mattered. And we know why a film about a first flight could mean more to him than another role ever could. He grew up on the flight path. That is where the story begins, and it is where it ends. Not in a Cannes theater, not in a Nassau courtroom, not in a Bahamas bathroom on a January morning, but in a backyard in New Jersey, where a small boy used to lie on the grass and watch the planes go over. He did not know then what the sky was going to ask of him. He only knew that he wanted to be up there, that something in the altitude made sense in a way that the ground did not always manage. He spent the next 64 years finding out what it cost. He danced until he was the most photographed young man in America. He flew until he had 9,000 hours and a runway outside his front door. He loved 4 times in 4 different shapes and lost 3 of them. He sat in a courtroom and described the morning his son died. He stood in front of cameras and gave the world the version of himself it needed, while carrying, in the version no camera could reach, the weight of every name he was still saying in the present tense. And then, at 72, he wrote a film about the first flight, not about the career, not about the comeback, not about the white suit or the pointed finger, or the night the electrical system failed at 12,000 feet. about the morning his sister took him to the airport, and he was 8 years old, and the plane lifted, and the ground fell away, and he understood, for the first time, in the way that certain things are understood only once and never forgotten, that the sky was real, and he could go there. His son, Benjamin, once asked him if he was going to die too. He told him, "Nobody knows when they're going to go or when they're going to stay." That is not a comforting sentence, but it is an honest one. And after everything John Travolta has carried, after Diana, after the black cockpit, after Jett, after Kelly, after 32 years of weather, honesty may be the only form of control that was ever really his to keep. He is still flying. The runway is still there. And somewhere above the Florida dark, a 72-year-old man is bringing the plane home. If John Travolta's story moved you, if you grew up watching him in Grease, in Pulp Fiction, in Saturday Night Fever, or simply remember what it felt like when his name meant something, leave a comment below. Tell us which role you think of first when you hear his name. And if this story was worth an hour of your evening, leave a like. It takes 1 second, and it tells us these stories are worth telling. Before you go, tell us what city you are watching from tonight. There is something about knowing that people from different places are sitting with the same story at the same hour. Subscribe so you never miss another one.